Let me start with a confession. I've spent the better part of my career staring at how people fall down. Not literally, well, sometimes literally, but professionally. And if there's one thing 30-odd years of research has taught me, it's this. Balance isn't something you either have or you don't. It's not a gift some of us got and others didn't. It's a skill. And like any skill, it can rust, or it can be sharpened. Here's the myth I want to dismantle right out of the gate, that losing your balance as you age is simply part of getting older, something to be quietly accepted, like gray hair or a stubborn knee. The latest research tells a very different story. It turns out the body is remarkably willing to relearn stability. At 70, at 80, even beyond if you give it the right kind of practice. So this morning, I want to walk you through what the science actually says works. Not the gadgets, not the gimmicks, not the balance boards gathering dust in the garage. The real, evidence-backed strategies that are changing how we think about aging on your feet. Because the goal isn't just to avoid a fall. The goal is to walk into a room, any surface, any moment, with confidence. Let's get into it. Let me begin with the idea that changes everything else I'm going to tell you today. Balance is trainable, not fixed. Not something handed to you at birth and slowly withdrawn as the years pass, like some kind of biological repossession. Trainable, the same way a muscle is trainable, the same way a habit is trainable, the same way a mind can learn a new language at 60 just as it could at 6, only with a bit more patience required. For decades, the prevailing wisdom in medicine was quietly pessimistic. We assumed the nervous system peaked somewhere in our 20s or 30s and then began a long, slow decline. A one-way street with no exits, no detours, no chance to turn around. Balance under this old model was just another casualty of time. You had it, and then gradually you didn't. Doctors would nod sympathetically, hand over a cane, and call it a day. But here's what the research over the last 15 years has quietly, and then not so quietly, overturned. The brain and body retain what scientists call neuroplasticity, the capacity to rewire, adapt, and strengthen neural pathways, well into our 80s and 90s. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 90-year-old nervous systems, in controlled studies, have shown measurable improvements in postural control after just weeks of targeted training. Not maintained decline, not slowed decline, improvement. And it's not only the brain doing the adapting. Muscle tissue itself responds to demand at any age. There's a persistent myth that older muscle is somehow deaf to exercise, that it just doesn't listen the way younger muscle does. The data says otherwise. Studies tracking resistance training in populations well into their 9th decade show muscle fiber growth, increased strength, and, critically for our topic today, improved reaction time when the body needs to correct itself mid-stumble. That reaction time, that split-second correction, is very often the difference between a stumble and a fall, and a fall and a fracture. What's happening physiologically is this. Balance isn't managed by any single system. It's a conversation between your inner ear, your eyes, the pressure sensors in your feet, the proprioceptive signals from your joints, and a rapid-fire processing center in your cerebellum that's constantly integrating all of it and issuing micro-corrections you never consciously notice. When you train balance, you're not just strengthening a muscle. You're improving the speed and accuracy of that entire conversation. You're teaching the whole system to communicate faster and more efficiently. This is why the researchers I collaborate with have stopped using language like preventing decline and started using language like building capacity. It's a subtle shift, but it matters enormously because it changes what we tell patients and what we tell ourselves. Preventing decline is defensive. It's playing not to lose. Building capacity is offensive. It's playing to win at any age. I think of a woman I met during a community fall prevention study, 83 years old, arthritis in both knees, had already had one hip fracture from a fall 2 years prior. Her family, understandably, had started treating her like something fragile, something to be protected rather than challenged. 12 weeks into a structured balance and strength program, her physical therapist recorded a striking finding. Her single-leg stance time, a common clinical measure of balance, had more than doubled. Not because we gave her a new hip, not because we gave her a new pair of shoes, because her nervous system did exactly what nervous systems do when given the right stimulus. It adapted. This is the foundation everything else in this talk rests on. If balance were fixed, if decline were truly inevitable and irreversible, then the rest of what I'm about to share with you would be little more than damage control, useful perhaps, but limited in ambition. But because balance is trainable, everything changes. The conversation shifts from managing loss to actively building strength, speed, and confidence at any age. Starting today, starting this week, starting the moment you decide the old assumptions no longer apply to you. Let's talk about the foundation beneath every other balance strategy you'll ever hear about, because without it, none of the rest matters much. Strength. Specifically, strength in the legs and the core. If balance is the conversation between your senses and your nervous system that I described a moment ago, then strength is the physical infrastructure that makes the conversation worth having in the first place. You can have the fastest, most finely tuned reflexes in the world, but if the muscles required to execute the correction aren't strong enough to respond, the reflex arrives and finds nothing to work with. Here's what the research has made increasingly clear. The single strongest predictor of fall risk in older adults isn't age. It isn't even a history of previous falls, as significant as that is. It's leg strength, particularly in the quadriceps, hip abductors, and ankle stabilizers, combined with core stability that keeps the trunk upright and controlled when the ground beneath you does something unexpected. A crack in the sidewalk, a rug that slides, a moment of distraction on a staircase. In that split second, it's not your reflexes alone that save you. It's whether your legs have the raw force production to catch your weight and your core has the stability to keep you from folding. Consider what actually happens biomechanically when someone begins to lose their balance. The body doesn't fall in slow motion. It happens in a fraction of a second, and the recovery, if it comes, has to happen just as fast. A misstep triggers what's called a protective stepping response, a rapid, often involuntary lunge to reposition the base of support under the shifting center of mass. That stepping response requires explosive strength in the hip and thigh muscles. Without sufficient strength, the step either doesn't happen fast enough, doesn't cover enough distance, or the leg simply buckles under the load. This is why so many falls in older adults aren't caused by a lack of awareness. People often report feeling themselves start to go and being unable to do anything about it. The brain sent the signal. The body didn't have the horsepower to execute it. This is precisely why resistance training has moved from a nice-to-have recommendation to what many researchers now consider a non-negotiable pillar of fall prevention. Multiple longitudinal studies tracking older adults over several years have found that structured strength training, using resistance bands, bodyweight exercises, or light weights 2 to 3 times a week, produces measurable reductions in fall incidence, often in the range of 30 to 40%. That is not a marginal effect. That is one of the largest, most reliable interventions in the entire field of geriatric health, and it costs nothing but a chair, a resistance band, and consistency. The core deserves particular attention here because it's often overlooked in favor of leg work. Your core, the deep stabilizing muscles running through your abdomen, lower back, and pelvis, functions like the mast of a ship. When a gust of wind hits, it's not the sails that keep the ship upright, it's the mast holding steady beneath them. A weak core means that even strong legs are operating on an unstable platform. Every correction your legs attempt gets undermined by a trunk that sways, twists, or collapses forward. Researchers studying trunk control in older adults have found that core stability training, even in modest amounts, improves what's called postural sway. The small, constant adjustments your body makes just standing still, which turns out to be a remarkably accurate predictor of future fall risk. What I find most encouraging in this body of research is how little it takes to move the needle. We're not talking about young athletes in a gym doing heavy squats. We're talking about seated leg extensions, sit-to-stand exercises from a chair, gentle planks modified for the floor or a countertop, resistance band rows. Small, deliberate, progressive loading of the muscles that matter most. The body responds to demand regardless of the starting point, and the studies bear this out again and again. Strength gained in the 70s and 80s translates directly into fewer falls, shorter hospital stays when falls do occur, and a faster return to independence afterward. Now, let's move beyond strength alone, because here's something the research has made surprisingly clear. You can build strong legs and a stable core and still fall, if that strength was only ever trained in one direction. Standing still. Sitting to standing. Simple, predictable, straight-line movement. Real life doesn't work that way, and neither, it turns out, does effective balance training. This brings us to the third pillar. Multi-directional dynamic movement consistently outperforms static balance drills, and practices like Tai Chi and reactive balance training have emerged as some of the most powerful interventions we have. Let's start with why static balance training, the classic image of standing on one leg or standing with feet together, eyes closed, arms out, has such limited real-world payoff. It's not that these exercises are worthless. They have their place, particularly for beginners building baseline awareness, but think about how falls actually happen. Almost nobody falls while standing perfectly still on flat ground. Falls happen while turning to answer someone calling your name. They happen while stepping off a curb at a slight angle, or reaching sideways for something on a shelf, or navigating a patch of uneven pavement while carrying groceries. These are multi-directional, unpredictable, weight-shifting moments. And if all your training has taught your nervous system is how to hold still, you haven't actually trained the skill you need most, which is how to recover. This is where Tai Chi enters the research with a level of evidence that frankly surprised even seasoned researchers when the data started rolling in. Multiple large-scale studies, some involving thousands of participants across years of follow-up, have found that regular Tai Chi practice reduces fall risk by a striking margin, in some analyses more than any single strength intervention on its own. Why would a slow, seemingly gentle martial art outperform targeted exercise? Because Tai Chi is, at its core, a masterclass in weight shifting. Every movement involves transferring weight slowly and deliberately from one leg to the other, rotating the trunk, reaching in different planes, all while maintaining control. It trains the exact multi-directional, dynamic stability that real-world falls demand, and it does so at a pace slow enough that the nervous system can build precision before adding speed. Reactive balance training takes this a step further, and it's an area of research that's gained enormous momentum recently. The idea is deceptively simple. Instead of only training people to maintain balance, train them to lose it in a controlled and safe way and recover. This might involve a therapist gently perturbing someone's stance, or specialized equipment like a treadmill that introduces small unexpected slips, or a moving platform that shifts under a person's feet. The logic is compelling once you hear it. Falls are, almost by definition, unexpected. You cannot fully prepare for an unexpected event by only practicing expected controlled movements. But you can train the recovery response itself, the speed and effectiveness of that protective stepping reaction we discussed earlier, by exposing the body safely and repeatedly to small controlled losses of balance. Studies using this approach have shown remarkable results, in some cases reducing fall rates more effectively and more quickly than months of traditional strength or static balance programs. What ties these approaches together is the principle of specificity. The nervous system gets remarkably good at whatever you repeatedly ask it to do, and it stays fairly narrow in how it generalizes that skill. Train standing still, and you get very good at standing still. Train weight shifting, rotation, and recovery from small perturbations, and you build a nervous system genuinely prepared for the chaos of daily life. This is why the most forward-thinking balance programs today are moving away from static holds as the centerpiece and toward dynamic, multi-directional movement as the foundation, walking with head turns, stepping over obstacles, practicing controlled stumbles and recoveries, incorporating rotation, and reaching into every exercise. The encouraging part, again, is accessibility. Tai Chi classes exist in community centers, senior living facilities, and increasingly online, often free or low cost. Reactive balance training is expanding rapidly in physical therapy clinics as the evidence mounts. Neither requires expensive equipment or elite athleticism. Both require only a willingness to move in directions beyond the straight and narrow, and a recognition that the balance you need in real life is dynamic, responsive, and endlessly adaptable, exactly like the training that builds it. Let's turn now to something that rarely gets the attention it deserves in conversations about balance, because it's easy to focus entirely on muscles and strength and forget that balance is, at its heart, a sensory problem before it's ever a strength problem. Your body needs accurate information before it can produce an accurate response, and that information comes from three primary sources: your eyes, your inner ear, and the proprioceptive sensors embedded throughout your muscles, joints, and the soles of your feet. Balance is what happens when these three systems integrate seamlessly, and balance problems very often aren't a strength issue at all. They're a signal issue. The muscles are ready and willing. The message never arrived, or arrived garbled. Let's start with vision, because it carries more of the balance workload than most people realize. Something in the range of 70% of your balance information, according to several sensory integration studies, comes through the eyes. Vision tells your brain where the horizon is, how fast the environment is moving relative to you, where obstacles sit in space, and critically, it provides the reference point your inner ear and joints calibrate against. This is why balance problems so often worsen dramatically in dim lighting or in unfamiliar environments, or when someone is wearing outdated glasses with the wrong prescription. Researchers studying fall risk have found that uncorrected vision problems, including something as seemingly minor as poor contrast sensitivity, which standard eye exams often don't even test for, correlate strongly with fall incidence. Cataracts in particular have emerged in the literature as a significant and under-addressed fall risk factor, and studies following patients after cataract surgery have documented measurable drops in fall rates in the months afterward. The message here is straightforward and often overlooked. An annual eye exam is a balance intervention, not just a vision intervention. Then there's the inner ear, home to the vestibular system, which functions essentially as your body's internal gyroscope. Tiny fluid-filled canals and sensory structures detect rotation, acceleration, and the position of your head relative to gravity, feeding that information continuously to the brain. This system is remarkably sensitive and remarkably prone to disruption as we age. Conditions like benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, often abbreviated BPPV, become dramatically more common in older adults and can produce sudden, disorienting episodes of dizziness, triggered by something as simple as turning over in bed or looking up at a shelf. The encouraging research here is that vestibular issues, once properly diagnosed, are often highly treatable, sometimes with surprisingly simple repositioning maneuvers performed by a trained clinician that resolve symptoms in a single session. Yet studies suggest vestibular dysfunction remains significantly underdiagnosed in older populations, frequently dismissed or misattributed to general aging rather than identified as the specific addressable condition it often is. And then, proprioception, the quiet, often invisible sense that tells your brain where your body is in space without you having to look. The nerve endings in your joints, muscles, and particularly the soles of your feet are constantly relaying information about pressure, angle, and position. This sense tends to decline gradually with age, sometimes worsened by conditions like peripheral neuropathy, often related to diabetes, which can significantly dull sensation in the feet. When proprioceptive input weakens, the brain effectively loses its ground-level reporting system. Research has shown that something as simple as barefoot balance exercises, or textured surface training, or specific foot strengthening protocols can meaningfully improve proprioceptive sensitivity, essentially sharpening the resolution of the signals traveling from feet to brain. Footwear matters here too, more than most people assume. Overly cushioned or unstable shoes can blunt proprioceptive feedback from the feet, and several studies have pointed to firmer, well-fitted footwear as a small but meaningful factor in fall prevention. What the research increasingly emphasizes is that these three systems need to be assessed together, not in isolation, because deficits often compound. Someone with mild vision decline and mild vestibular decline may function reasonably well with either issue alone, but combined, the effect on balance can be dramatically amplified, more than the sum of the individual parts. This is why comprehensive fall risk assessments increasingly include vision screening, vestibular testing, and proprioceptive evaluation alongside the standard strength and mobility measures. Addressing balance seriously means treating it as the sensory integration challenge it actually is, checking the wiring as carefully as we check the muscle. So where does this leave us? Balance isn't a verdict handed down by age. It's a skill, built on a trainable nervous system, fortified by real strength, sharpened through dynamic movement, and guided by senses that deserve just as much attention as muscles do. The research is consistent and frankly hopeful. It is never too late to start, and the gains, even small ones, compound into something that matters enormously. Independence, confidence, and the simple freedom of walking into any room without fear of the floor beneath you. I'll leave you with this. Don't wait for a fall to take balance seriously. Start today, start small, start consistent. Thank you for listening. If this talk gave you something worth thinking about, I'd love for you to subscribe and drop a comment below. I read every one, and I'm always curious what questions or experiences you're bringing to this conversation.